Hey everyone, this is a piece by Emma Goldman titled My Disillusionment in Russia, Afterword. So this is the afterword to her book, My Disillusionment in Russia. Section 1. Non-Bolshevik socialist critics of the Russian failure contend that the revolution could not have succeeded in Russia because industrial conditions had not reached the necessary climax in that country. They point to Marx, who taught that a social revolution is possible only in countries with a highly developed industrial system and its attendant social antagonisms. They therefore claim that the Russian Revolution could not be a social revolution, and that historically it had to evolve along constitutional democratic lines, complemented by a growing industry, in order to ripen the country economically for the basic change. This orthodox Marxian view leaves an important factor out of consideration, a factor perhaps more vital to the possibility and success of a social revolution than even the industrial element. That is the psychology of the masses at a given period. Why is there, for instance, no social revolution in the United States, France, or even in Germany? Surely these countries have reached the industrial development set by Marx as the culminating stage. The truth is that industrial development and sharp social contrasts are of themselves by no means sufficient to give birth to a new society or to call forth a social revolution. The necessary social consciousness, the required mass psychology, is missing in such countries as the United States and the others mentioned. That explains why no social revolution has taken place there. In this regard, Russia had the advantage of other more industrialized and, quote, civilized, end quote, lands. It is true that Russia was not as advanced industrially as her Washington neighbors, but the Russian mass psychology, inspired and intensified by the February Revolution, was ripening at so fast a pace that within a few months the people were ready for such ultra-revolutionary slogans as "all power to the Soviets" and "the land to the peasants, the factories to the workers." The significance of these slogans should not be underestimated. Expressing in a large degree the instinctive and semi-conscious will of the people, they signified the complete social, economic, and industrial reorganization of Russia. What country in Europe or America is prepared to interpret such revolutionary mottos in life? Yet in Russia, in the months of June and July 1917, these slogans became popular and were enthusiastically and actively taken up in the form of direct action by the bulk of the industrial and agrarian population of more than 150 millions. That was sufficient proof of the, quote, ripeness, end quote, of the Russian people for the social revolution. As to economic, quote, preparedness, end quote, in the Marxian sense, it must not be forgotten that Russia is preeminently an agrarian country. Marx's dictum presupposes the industrialization of the peasant and farmer population in every highly developed society as a step towards social fitness for revolution. But events in Russia in 1917 demonstrated that revolution does not await this process of industrialization, and what is more important, cannot be made to wait. The Russian peasants began to expropriate the landlords, and the workers took possession of the factories without taking cognizance of Marxian dicta. This popular action, by virtue of its own logic, ushered in the social revolution in Russia, upsetting all Marxian calculations. The psychology of the Slav proved stronger than social democratic theories. That psychology involved the passionate yearning for liberty nurtured by a century of revolutionary agitation among all classes of society. The Russian people had fortunately remained politically unsophisticated and untouched by the corruption and confusion created among the proletariat of other countries by, quote, democratic, end quote, liberty and self-government. The Russian remained, in this sense, natural and simple, unfamiliar with the subtleties of politics, of parliamentary trickery, and legal makeshifts. On the other hand, his primitive sense of justice and right was strong and vital, without the disintegrating finesse of pseudo-civilization. He knew what he wanted, and he did not wait for, quote, historic inevitability, end quote, to bring it to him. He employed direct action. The revolution to him was a fact of life, not a mere theory for discussion. Thus the social revolution took place in Russia in spite of the industrial backwardness of the country. But to make the revolution was not enough. It was necessary for it to advance and broaden, to develop into economic and social reconstruction. That phase of the revolution necessitated fullest play of personal initiative and collective effort. The development and success of the revolution depended on the broadest exercise of the creative genius of the people, on the cooperation of the intellectual and manual proletariat. Common interest is the leitmotif of all revolutionary endeavor, especially on its constructive side. The spirit of mutual purpose and solidarity swept Russia with a mighty wave in the first days of the October-November Revolution. Inherent in that enthusiasm were forces that could have moved mountains if intelligently guided by exclusive consideration for the well-being of the whole people. The medium for such effective guidance was on hand. The labor organizations and the cooperatives with which Russia was covered, as with a network of bridges combining the city with the country, the Soviets which sprang into being responsive to the needs of the Russian people. And finally, the intelligentsia whose traditions for a century expressed heroic devotion to the cause of Russia's emancipation. But such a development was by no means within the program of the Bolsheviki. For several months following October, they suffered the popular forces to manifest themselves, the people carrying the revolution into ever-widening channels. But as soon as the Communist Party felt itself sufficiently strong in the government saddle, it began to limit the scope of popular activity. All the succeeding acts of the Bolsheviki, all their following policies, changes of policies, their compromises and retreats, their methods of suppression and persecution, their terrorism and extermination of all other political views, were but the means to an end, the retaining of the state power in the hands of the Communist Party. Indeed, the Bolsheviki themselves, in Russia, made no secret of it. The Communist Party, they contended, is the advance guard of the proletariat, and the dictatorship must rest in its hands. Alas, the Bolsheviki reckoned without their host, without the peasantry, whom neither the Rezyoriska, the Cheka, nor the wholesale shooting could persuade to support the Bolshevik regime. The peasantry became the rock upon which the best laid plans and schemes of Lenin were wrecked. But Lenin, a nimble acrobat, was skilled in performing within the narrowest margin. The new economic policy was introduced just in time to ward off the disaster, which was slowly but surely taking the whole communist edifice. Section 2. The, quote, new economic policy, end quote, came as a surprise and a shock to most communists. They saw in it a reversal of everything that their party had been proclaiming, a reversal of communism itself. In protest, some of the oldest members of the party, men who had faced danger and persecution under the old regime while Lenin and Trotsky lived abroad in safety, left the Communist Party embittered and disappointed. The leaders then declared a lockout. They ordered the clearing of the party ranks of all, quote, doubtful, end quote, elements. Everybody suspected of an independent attitude, and those who did not accept the new economic policy as the last word in revolutionary wisdom were expelled. Among them were communists who for years had rendered most devoted service. Some of them, hurt to the quick by the unjust and brutal procedure, and shaken to their depths by the collapse of what they held most high, even resorted to suicide. But the smooth sailing of Lenin's new gospel had to be assured. The gospel of the sanctity of private property and the freedom of cutthroat competition erected upon the ruins of 4 years of revolution. However, communist indignation over the new economic policy merely indicated the confusion of mind on the part of Lenin's opponents. What else but mental confusion could approve of the numerous acrobatic political stunts of Lenin, and yet grow indignant at the final somersault, its logical culmination? The trouble with the devout communists was that they clung to the immaculate conception of the communist state, which by the aid of the revolution was to redeem the world. But most of the leading communists never entertained such a delusion, least of all Lenin. During my first interview, I received the impression that Lenin was a shrewd politician who knew exactly what he was about, and that he would stop at nothing to achieve his ends. After hearing Lenin speak on several occasions and reading Lenin's works, I became convinced that Lenin had very little concern in the revolution, and that communism to Lenin was a very remote thing. The centralized political state was Lenin's deity, to which everything else was to be sacrificed. Someone said that Lenin would sacrifice the revolution to save Russia. Lenin's policies, however, have proven that he was willing to sacrifice both the revolution and the country, or at least part of the country, in order to realize his political scheme with what was left of Russia. Lenin was the most pliable politician in history. He could be an ultra-revolutionary, a compromiser, and conservative at the same time. When like a mighty wave the cry swept over Russia, all power to the Soviets, Lenin swam with the tide. When the peasants took possession of the land and the workers of the factories, Lenin not only approved of those direct methods but went further. He issued the famous motto, "Rob the robbers," a slogan which served to confuse the minds of the people and caused untold injury to revolutionary idealism. Never before did any real revolutionist interpret social expropriation as the transfer of wealth from one set of individuals to another. Yet that was exactly what Lenin's slogan meant. The indiscriminate and irresponsible raids, the accumulation of the wealth of the former bourgeoisie by the new Soviet bureaucracy, the chicanery practiced toward those whose only crime was their former status, were all the results of Lenin's, quote, "rob the robbers" policy. The whole subsequent history of the revolution is a kaleidoscope of Lenin's compromises and betrayals of his own slogans. Bolshevik acts and methods since the October days may seem to contradict the new economic policy, but in reality they are links in the chain which had to forge the all-powerful centralized government with state capitalism as its economic expression. Lenin possessed clarity of vision and an iron will. Lenin knew how to make his comrades in Russia and outside of it believe that his scheme was true socialism and his method the revolution. No wonder that Lenin felt such contempt for his flock, which he never hesitated to fling into their faces. Quote, "Only fools can believe that communism is possible in Russia now," end quote, was Lenin's reply to the opponents of the new economic policy. As a matter of fact, Lenin was right. True communism was never attempted in Russia, unless one considers 33 categories of pay, different food rations, privileges to some, and indifference to the great mass, as communism. In the early period of the revolution, it was comparatively easy for the Communist Party to possess itself of power. All the revolutionary elements, carried away by the ultra-revolutionary promises of the Bolsheviki, helped the latter to power. Once in possession of the state, the communists began the process of elimination. All the political parties and groups which refused to submit to the new dictatorship had to go. First the anarchists and left social revolutionists, then the Mensheviki and other opponents from the right, and finally somebody who dared aspire to an opinion of his own. Similar was the fate of all independent organizations. They were either subordinated to the needs of the new state or destroyed altogether, as were the Soviets, the trade unions, and the cooperatives, three great factors for the realization of the hopes of the revolution. The Soviets first manifested themselves in the Revolution of 1905. The Soviets played an important part during that brief but significant period. Though the revolution was crushed, the Soviet idea remained rooted in the minds and hearts of the Russian masses. At the first dawn, which illuminated Russia in February 1917, the Soviets revived again and came into bloom in a very short time. To the people of the Soviets, by no means represented a curtailment of the spirit of the revolution. On the contrary, the revolution was to find its highest, freest practical expression through the Soviets. That was why the Soviets so spontaneously and rapidly spread throughout Russia. The Bolsheviki realized the significance of the popular trend and joined the cry. But once in control of the government, the communists saw that the Soviets threatened the supremacy of the state. At the same time, they could not destroy them arbitrarily without undermining their own prestige at home and abroad as the sponsors of the Soviet system. They began to shear them gradually of their powers and finally to subordinate them to their own needs. The Russian trade unions were much more amenable to emasculation. Numerically and in point of revolutionary fiber, they were still in their childhood. By declaring adherence to the trade unions obligatory, the Russian labor organizations gained in physical stature, but mentally they remained in the infant stage. The communist state became the wet nurse of the trade unions. In return, the organization served as the flunky of the state. Quote, "A school for communism," end quote, said Lenin in the famous controversy on the functions of the trade unions. Quite right, but an antiquated school where the spirit of the child is fettered and crushed. Nowhere in the world are labor organizations as subservient to the will and the dictates of the state as they are in Bolshevik Russia. The fate of the cooperatives is too well known to require elucidation. The cooperatives are the most essential link between the city and the country. Their value to the revolution as a popular and successful medium of exchange and distribution, and to the reconstruction of Russia, was incalculable. The Bolsheviki transformed them into cogs of the government machine and thereby destroyed their usefulness and efficiency. New section 3. It is now clear why the Russian Revolution, as conducted by the Communist Party, was a failure. The political power of the party, organized and centralized in the state, sought to maintain itself by all means at hand. The central authorities attempted to force the activities of the people into forms corresponding with the purposes of the party. The sole aim of the latter was to strengthen the state and monopolize all economic, political, and social activities, even all cultural manifestations. The revolution had an entirely different object, and in its very character, it was the negation of authority and centralization. It strove to open ever larger fields for proletarian expression and to multiply the phases of individual and collective effort. The aims and tendencies of the revolution were diametrically opposed to those of the ruling political party. Just as diametrically opposed were the methods of the revolution and of the state. Those of the former were inspired by the spirit of the revolution itself, that is to say, by emancipation from all oppressive and limiting forces, in short, by libertarian principles. The methods of the state, on the contrary, of the Bolshevik state as of every government, were based on coercion, which in the course of things necessarily developed into systematic violence, oppression, and terrorism. Thus two opposing tendencies struggled for supremacy, the Bolshevik state against the revolution. That struggle was a life and death struggle. The two tendencies, contradictory in aims and methods, could not work harmoniously. The triumph of the state meant the defeat of the revolution. It would be an error to assume that the failure of the revolution was due entirely to the character of the Bolsheviki. Fundamentally, it was the result of the principles and methods of Bolshevism. It was the authoritarian spirit and principles of the state which stifled the libertarian and liberating aspirations. Were any other political party in control of the government in Russia, the result would have been essentially the same. It is not so much the Bolsheviki who killed the Russian Revolution as the Bolshevik idea. It was Marxism, however modified, in short, fanatical governmentalism. Only this understanding of the underlying forces that crushed the revolution can present the true lesson of the world-stirring event. The Russian Revolution reflects on a small scale the century-old struggle of the libertarian principle against the authoritarian. For what is progress, if not the more general acceptance of the principles of liberty as against those of coercion? The Russian Revolution was a libertarian step defeated by the Bolshevik state, by the temporary victory of the reactionary, the governmental idea. The victory was due to a number of causes. Most of them have already been dealt with in the preceding chapters. The main cause, however, was not the industrial backwardness of Russia, as claimed by many writers on the subject. That cause was cultural, which, though giving the Russian people certain advantages over their more sophisticated neighbors, also had some fatal disadvantages. The Russian was, quote, culturally backward, end quote, in the sense of being unspoiled by political and parliamentary corruption. On the other hand, their very condition involved inexperience in the political game and a naive faith in the miraculous power of the party that talked the loudest and made the most promises. The faith in the party of government served to enslave the Russian people to the Communist Party even before the great masses realized that the yoke had been put around their necks. The libertarian principle was strong in the initial days of the revolution, the need for free expression all-absorbing. But when the first wave of enthusiasm seeped into the ebb of everyday prosaic life, a firm conviction was needed to keep the fires of liberty burning. There was only a comparative handful in the great vastness of Russia to keep those fires lit. The anarchists, whose number was small and whose efforts, absolutely suppressed under the Tsar, had had no time to bear fruit. The Russian people, to some extent instinctive anarchists, were yet too unfamiliar with true libertarian principles and methods to apply them effectively to life. Most of the Russian anarchists themselves were unfortunately still in the mesh of limited group activities and of individualistic endeavor as against the more important social and collective efforts. The anarchists, the future unbiased historian will admit, have played a very important role in the Russian Revolution, a role far more significant and fruitful than their comparatively small number would have led one to expect. Yet honesty and sincerity compel me to state that their work would have been of infinitely greater practical value had they been better organized and equipped to guide the released energies of the people toward the reorganization of life on a libertarian foundation. One second. But the failure of the anarchists in the Russian Revolution, in the sense just indicated, does by no means argue the defeat of the libertarian idea. On the contrary, the Russian Revolution has demonstrated beyond doubt that the state idea, state socialism, in all its manifestations, economic, political, social, educational, is entirely and hopelessly bankrupt. Never before in all history has authority, government, the state, proved so inherently static, reactionary, and even counter-revolutionary in effect. In short, the very antithesis of revolution. It remains true, as it has through all progress, that only the libertarian spirit and method can bring man a step further in his eternal striving for the better, finer, and freer life. Applied to the great social upheavals known as revolutions, this tendency is as potent as in the ordinary evolutionary process. The authoritarian method has been a failure all through history, and now it has again failed in the Russian Revolution. So far, human ingenuity has discovered no other principle except the libertarian. For man has indeed uttered the highest wisdom when he said that liberty is the mother of order, not its daughter. All political tenets and parties notwithstanding, no revolution can be truly and permanently successful unless that revolution puts its emphatic veto upon all tyranny and centralization and determinedly strives to make the revolution a real revaluation of all economic, social, and cultural values, not mere substitution of one political party for another in the control of the government, not the masking of autocracy by proletarian slogans, not the dictatorship of a new class over an old class, not political scene shifting of any kind, but the complete reversal of all these authoritarian principles will alone serve the revolution. In the economic field, this transformation must be in the hands of the industrial masses. The latter have the choice between an industrial state and anarcho-syndicalism. In the case of the industrial state, the menace to the constructive development of the new social structure will be as great as from the political state. It would become a dead weight upon the growth of the new form of life. For that very reason, syndicalism or industrialism alone is not, as its exponents claim, sufficient unto itself. It is only when the libertarian spirit permeates the economic organizations of the workers that the manifold creative energies of the people can manifest themselves and the revolution be safeguarded and defended. Only free initiative and popular participation in the affairs of the revolution can prevent the terrible blunders committed in Russia. For instance, with fuel only 100 versts, bracket, about 66 miles, end bracket, from Petrograd, there would have been no necessity for the city to suffer from cold had the workers' economic organizations of Petrograd been free to exercise their initiative for the common good. The peasants of the Ukraine would not have been hampered in the cultivation of their land had they had access to the farm implements stacked up in the warehouses of Kharkov and other industrial centers awaiting orders from Moscow for their distribution. These are characteristic examples of Bolshevik governmentalism and centralization, which should serve as a warning to the workers of Europe and America of the destructive effects of statism. The industrial power of the masses, expressed through their libertarian associations, anarcho-syndicalism, is alone able to organize successfully the economic life and carry on production. On the other hand, the cooperatives, working in harmony with the industrial bodies, serve as the distributing and exchange media between city and country, and at the same time link in fraternal bond the industrial and agrarian masses. A common tie of mutual service and aid is created, which is the strongest bulwark of the revolution, far more effectively than compulsory labor, the Red Army, or terrorism. In that way alone, can revolution act as a leaven to quicken the development of new social forms and inspire the masses to greater achievements. But libertarian industrial organizations and the cooperatives are not the only media in the interplay of the complex phases of social life. There are the cultural forces which, though closely related to the economic activities, have yet their own functions to perform. In Russia, the communist state became the sole arbiter of all the needs of the social body. The result, as already described, was complete cultural stagnation and the paralysis of all creative endeavor. If such a debacle is to be avoided in the future, the cultural forces, while remaining rooted in economic soil, must yet retain independent scope and freedom of expression. Not adherence to the dominant political party, but devotion to the revolution, knowledge, ability, and above all, the creative impulse should be the criterion of fitness for cultural work. In Russia, this was made impossible almost from the beginning of the October Revolution, by the violent separation of the intelligentsia and the masses. It is true that the original offender in this case was the intelligentsia, especially the technical intelligentsia, which in Russia tenaciously clung, as it does in other countries, to the coattails of the bourgeoisie. This element, unable to comprehend the significance of revolutionary events, strove to stem the tide by wholesale sabotage. But in Russia, there was also another kind of intelligentsia, one with a glorious revolutionary past of 100 years. That part of the intelligentsia kept faith with the people, though it could not unreservedly accept the new dictatorship. The fatal error of the Bolsheviki was that they made no distinction between the two elements. They met sabotage with wholesale terror against the intelligentsia as a class, and inaugurated a campaign of hatred more intensive than the persecution of the bourgeoisie itself, a method which created an abyss between the intelligentsia and the proletariat and reared a barrier against constructive work. Lenin was the first to realize that criminal blunder. Lenin pointed out that it was a grave error to lead the workers to believe that they could build up the industries and engage in cultural work without the aid and cooperation of the intelligentsia. The proletariat had neither the knowledge nor the training for the task, and the intelligentsia had to be restored in the direction of industrial life. But the recognition of one error never safeguarded Lenin and his party from immediately committing another. The technical intelligentsia was called back on terms which added disintegration to the antagonism against the regime. While the workers continued to starve, engineers, industrial experts, and technicians received high salaries, special privileges, and the best rations. They became the pampered employees of the state and the new slave drivers of the masses. The latter, fed for years on the fallacious teaching that muscle alone is necessary for a successful revolution and that only physical labor is productive, and incited by the campaign of hatred which stamped every intellectual, a counter-revolutionist, and speculator, could not make peace with those they had been taught to scorn and distrust. Unfortunately, Russia is not the only country where this proletarian attitude against the intelligentsia prevails. Everywhere political demagogues play upon the ignorance of the masses, teach them that education and culture are bourgeois prejudices, that the workers can do without them, and that they alone are able to rebuild society. The Russian Revolution has made it very clear that both brain and muscle are indispensable to the work of social regeneration. Intellectual and physical labor are as closely related in the social body as brain and hand in the human organism. One cannot function without the other. It is true that most intellectuals consider themselves a class apart from and superior to the workers, but social conditions everywhere are fast demolishing the high pedestal of the intelligentsia. They are made to see that they, too, are proletarians, even more dependent upon the economic master than the manual worker. Unlike the physical proletarian, who can pick up his tools and tramp the world in search of a change from a galling situation, the intellectual proletarians have their roots more firmly in their particular social environment and cannot so easily change their occupation or mode of living. It is therefore of utmost importance to bring home to the workers the rapid proletarianization of the intellectuals and the common tie thus created between them. If the Western world is to profit by the lessons of Russia, the demagogic flattery of the masses and blind antagonism toward the intelligentsia must cease. That does not mean, however, that the toilers should depend entirely on the intellectual element. On the contrary, the masses must begin right now to prepare and equip themselves for the great task the revolution will put upon them. They should acquire the knowledge and technical skill necessary for managing and directing the intricate mechanism of the industrial and social structure of their respective countries. But even at best, the workers will need the cooperation of the professional and cultural elements. Similarly, the latter must realize that their true interests are identical with those of the masses. Once the two social forces learn to blend into one harmonious whole, the tragic aspects of the Russian Revolution would to a great extent be eliminated. No one would be shot because he, quote, once acquired an education, end quote. The scientist, the engineer, the specialist, the investigator, the educator, and the creative artist, as well as the carpenter, machinist, and the rest, are all part and parcel of the collective force which is to shape the revolution into the great architect of the new social edifice. Not hatred, but unity, not antagonism, but fellowship, not shooting, but sympathy. That is the lesson of the great Russian debacle for the intelligentsia as well as the workers. All must learn the value of mutual aid and libertarian cooperation. Yet each must be able to remain independent in his own sphere and in harmony with the best he can yield to society. Only in that way will productive labor and educational and cultural endeavor express themselves in ever newer and richer forms. That is to me the all-embracing and vital moral thought. That is to me the all-embracing and vital moral taught by the Russian Revolution. Section 4. In the previous pages, I have tried to point out why Bolshevik principles, methods, and tactics failed, and that similar principles and methods applied in any other country, even of the highest industrial development, must also fail. I have further shown that it is not only Bolshevism that failed, but Marxism itself. That is to say, the state idea, the authoritarian principle, has been proven bankrupt by the experience of the Russian Revolution. If I were to sum up my whole argument in one sentence, I should say, the inherent tendency of the state is to concentrate, to narrow and monopolize all social activities. The nature of revolution is, on the contrary, to grow, to broaden, and disseminate itself in ever wider circles. In other words, the state is institutional and static. Revolution is fluent, dynamic. These two tendencies are incompatible and mutually destructive. The state idea killed the Russian Revolution, and it must have the same result in all other revolutions unless the libertarian idea prevail. Yet I go much further. It is not only Bolshevism, Marxism, and governmentalism which are fatal to revolution as well as to all vital human progress. The main cause of the defeat of the Russian Revolution lies much deeper. It is to be found in the whole socialist conception of revolution itself. Socialist is capitalized here. The dominant, almost general idea of revolution, particularly the socialist idea, is that revolution is a violent change of social conditions through which one social class, the working class, becomes dominant over another class, the capitalist class. It is the conception of a purely physical change, and as such it involves only political scene shifting and institutional rearrangements. Bourgeois dictatorship is replaced by the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, or by that of its, quote, advanced guard. The Communist Party, Lenin takes the seat of the Romanovs, the imperial cabinet is rechristened Soviet of People's Commissars, Trotsky is appointed Minister of War, and the laborer becomes the military governor general of Moscow. That is, in essence, the Bolshevik conception of revolution, as translated into actual practice, and with a few minor alterations, it is also the idea of revolution held by all other socialist parties. This conception is inherently and fatally false. Revolution is indeed a violent process, but if it is to result only in a change of dictatorship, in a shifting of names and political personalities, then it is hardly worthwhile. It is surely not worth all the struggle and sacrifice, the stupendous loss in human life and cultural values that result from every revolution. If such a revolution were even to bring greater social well-being, which has not been the case in Russia, then it would also not be worth the terrific price paid. Mere improvement can be brought about without bloody revolution. It is not palliatives or reforms that are the real aim and purpose of the revolution, as I conceive it. In my opinion, a thousandfold strengthened by this Russian experience, the great mission of revolution, of the social revolution, is a fundamental transvaluation of values. A transvaluation not only of social but also of human values. The latter are even preeminent, for they are the basis of all social values. Our institutions and conditions rest upon deep-seated ideas. To change those conditions and at the same time leave the underlying ideas and values intact means only a superficial transformation, one that cannot be permanent or bring real betterment. It is a change of form only, not of substance, as so tragically proven by Russia. It is at once the great failure and the great tragedy of the Russian Revolution that it attempted, in the leadership of the ruling political party, to change only institutions and conditions, while ignoring entirely the human and social values involved in the revolution. Worse yet, in its mad passion for power, the communist state even sought to strengthen and deepen the very ideas and conceptions which the revolution had come to destroy. It supported and encouraged all the worst antisocial qualities and systematically destroyed the already awakened conception of the new revolutionary values. The sense of justice and equality, the love of liberty and of human brotherhood, these fundamentals of the regeneration of society, the communist state suppressed to the point of extermination. Man's instinctive sense of equity was branded a weak sentimentality. Human dignity and liberty became a bourgeois superstition. The sanctity of life, which is the very essence of social reconstruction, was condemned as anti-revolutionary, almost counter-revolutionary. This fearful perversion of fundamental values bore within itself the seed of destruction. With the conception that the revolution was only a means of securing political power, it was inevitable that all revolutionary values should be subordinated to the needs of the socialist state. Indeed, exploited to further the security of the newly acquired governmental power. Quote, reasons of state, end quote, masked as the, quote, interest of the revolution and of the people, end quote, became the sole criterion of action, even of feeling. Violence, the tragic inevitability of revolutionary upheavals, became an established custom, a habit, and was presently enthroned as the most powerful and, quote, ideal, end quote, institution. Did not Zinoviev himself canonize Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix, the head of the bloody Cheka, as the, quote, saint of the revolution, end quote? Were not the greatest public honors paid by the state to Uritsky, the founder and sadistic chief of the Petrograd Cheka? This perversion of the ethical values soon crystallized into the all-dominating slogan of the Communist Party: the end justifies all means. Similarly, in the past, the Inquisition and the Jesuits adopted this motto and subordinated to it all morality. It avenged itself upon the Jesuits as it did upon the Russian Revolution. In the wake of this slogan followed lying, deceit, hypocrisy, and treachery, murder, open and secret. It should be of utmost interest to students of social psychology that two movements as widely separated in time and ideas as Jesuitism and Bolshevism reached exactly similar results in the evolution of the principle that the end justifies all means. The historic parallel, almost entirely ignored so far, contains a most important lesson for all coming revolutions and for the whole future of mankind. There is no greater fallacy than the belief that aims and purposes are one thing, while methods and tactics are another. This conception is a potent menace to social regeneration. All human experience teaches that methods and means cannot be separated from the ultimate aim. The means employed become, through individual habit and social practice, part and parcel of the final purpose. They influence it, modify it, and presently the aims and means become identical. From the day of my arrival in Russia, I felt it, at first vaguely, then ever more consciously and clearly. Sorry, I lost my spot. The great and inspiring aims of the revolution became so clouded with and obscured by the methods used by the ruling political power that it was hard to distinguish what was temporary means and what final purpose. Psychologically and socially, the means necessarily influence and alter the aims. The whole history of man is continuous proof of the maxim that to divest one's methods of ethical concepts means to sink into the depths of utter demoralization. In that lies the real tragedy of the Bolshevik philosophy as applied to the Russian Revolution. May this lesson not be in vain. No revolution can ever succeed as a factor of liberation unless the means used to further it be identical in spirit and tendency with the purposes to be achieved. Revolution is the negation of the existing, a violent protest against man's inhumanity to man, with all the 1,001 slaveries it involves. It is the destroyer of dominant values upon which a complex system of injustice, oppression, and wrong has been built up by ignorance and brutality. It is the herald of new values, ushering in a transformation of the basic relations of man to man and of man to society. It is not a mere reformer, patching up some social evils, not a mere changer of forms and institutions, not only a redistributor of social well-being. It is all that, yet more, much more. It is first and foremost the transvaluator, the bearer of new values. It is the great teacher of the new ethics, inspiring man with a new concept of life and its manifestations in social relationships. It is the mental and spiritual regenerator. Its first ethical precept is the identity of means used and aims sought. The ultimate end of all revolutionary social change is to establish the sanctity of human life, the dignity of man, the right of every human being to liberty and well-being. Unless this be the essential aim of revolution, violent social changes would have no justification. For external social alterations can be, and have been, accomplished by the normal processes of evolution. Revolution, on the contrary, signifies not mere external change, but internal, basic fundamental change. The internal change of concepts and ideas permeating ever larger social strata finally culminates in the violent upheaval known as revolution. Shall that climax reverse the process of transvaluation, turn against it, betray it? That is what happened in Russia. On the contrary, the revolution itself must quicken and further the process of which it is the cumulative expression. Its main mission is to inspire it, to carry it to greater heights, give it fullest scope of expression. Only this is revolution true to itself. Applied in practice, it means that the period of the actual revolution, the so-called transitory stage, must be the introduction, the prelude to the new social conditions, is the threshold to the new life and the new house of man and humanity, and as such it must be of the spirit of the new life, harmonious with the construction of the new edifice. Today is the parent of tomorrow. The present casts its shadow far into the future. That is the law of life, individual and social. Revolution that divests itself of ethical values, divests itself of ethical values, thereby lays the foundation of injustice, deceit, and oppression for the future society. The means used to prepare the future become the future's cornerstone. Witness the tragic condition of Russia. The methods of state centralization have paralyzed individual initiative and effort. The tyranny of the dictatorship has cowed the people into slavish submission and all but extinguished the fires of liberty. Organized terrorism has depraved and brutalized the masses and stifled every idealistic aspiration. Institutionalized murder has cheapened human life, and all sense of the dignity of man and the value of life has been eliminated. Coercion at every step has made effort bitter. Labor a punishment has turned the whole of existence into a scheme of mutual deceit, and has revived the lowest and most brutal instincts of man, a sorry heritage to begin a new life of freedom and brotherhood. It cannot be sufficiently emphasized that revolution is in vain unless inspired by its ultimate ideal. Revolutionary methods must be in tune with revolutionary aims. The means used to further the revolution must harmonize with its purposes. In short, the ethical values which the revolution is to establish in the new society must be initiated with the revolutionary activities of the so-called transitional period. The latter can serve as a real and dependable bridge to the better life only if built of the same materials as the life to be achieved. Revolution is the mirror of the coming day. It is the child that is the man of tomorrow. The end. Thank you for listening.